Hi Year 11, so this revision video is focused on the language section of your exam. This is paper 1 and we are going to focus just on question 1. So question 1 has 4 marks available, so roughly we would suggest that you would spend about 5 minutes on this question, hopefully no longer because it's something that we want to get done nice and quickly. So in the question, the examiners will have selected a certain topic for you. When it comes to question 1, based on that topic, they are going to ask you to find and list details from a certain section of the source. The details that you select from the source can either be explicit or implicit. Now, if you're having a bit of a last-minute panic and thinking that you can't remember what explicit and implicit information is, let's have a little reminder. So explicit information is something that is stated clearly, leaving no room for doubt or confusion. So in other words, it's information which is very much on the surface. It tends to be relatively easy to notice because it's right there in front of us, almost as if it's stated as a fact. Implicit, on the other hand, is suggested though not directly expressed. So that's information that we tend to have to read between the lines to sort of figure out what is being suggested to us, rather than, presented to us as a fact. Now, before you answer the question, it's really important, and although this sounds pretty obvious, it's really important you actually look at what that question is asking you and focus on the key terms and instructions within that question. The source that I've picked to focus on today is one that you've all probably done before. It's the Jamaica Inn source. So the question was worded like this from the exam board. Read again the first part of the source, lines 1 to 7. List 4 things from this part of the source about the weather in Cornwall. So just ask yourself, just have a little think, what might the key bits of that question be? Pause the video if you need to. So hopefully you will have identified these 3 areas as being the most important bits within this question. Lines 1 to 7 is absolutely crucial because if you select any information which is not from within those lines, unfortunately that won't be credited. So even if your answer is correct and you're picking out information about the weather in Cornwall, if it's not from that section, you unfortunately won't get any marks for that. You will always be asked for this question to select 4 things, so that shouldn't change. This is the other crucial bit, weather in Cornwall. Now, this is the topic that the exam board has picked for you for this question, and you need to make sure that whatever information you're selecting is specifically about the weather. So for instance, there can sometimes be a tendency for you to kind of overlook what they're specifically asking you and be a bit more general with it. For instance, in this question, you wouldn't want to focus on Cornwall itself, anything that's said about that. You only want to focus on comments that are made about the weather. So the second step after you have underlined the necessary sections within the question is to draw a box around the section of text that you're being asked to consider. So this relates to line 1 to 7. So in this case, that would apply only to this section within the yellow box. After you've done that, you might like to underline any keywords or phrases in the text that link to that question topic. And as a little reminder, the question topic in this case is weather. So within this box, you might like to read that through and consider, okay, well, what points are being made specifically about the weather? I'm just going to give you a second to actually have a go at that yourself before we move on and have a look at the answers. So do pause the video if you need a little bit of extra time. Okay, so you can see from the red underlining here that these are just ideas within this yellow box that could actually relate to the weather. So we've got the weather had changed overnight, the idea of the wind, the idea of rain, cloaking mist, and the idea that the air itself was clammy cold. What you need to go really careful of with this question is that you don't look beyond the idea of weather. So for instance, when we have covered this in class, I seem to remember people getting caught by things like the granite sky. Now, that's quite a common mistake to make because you think, okay, sky's associated with the weather, but it's not specifically about the weather. That's commenting on the colour that the sky was. So do just be careful that you really take a tight focus on what the question's actually asking you. Now, in terms of you writing down your points once you have decided what 4 of them could be, there are actually there are 2 different ways that you can go about it. You can either paraphrase, which basically means to write it in your own words. So, for instance, we could have examples such as are written here. The weather in Cornwall was cold, it was also raining, mist was surrounding the hill, and the wind was blowing. So the student who answered like this just wrote the information in their own words, and that's absolutely fine. That would be accepted by the exam board. Alternatively, if it was appropriate, then you could actually just directly quote from the text. So, for instance, the weather had changed overnight is actually exactly how it's written in the text, and that is also correct. So either way is absolutely fine. So just a reminder of the process then. Try to think of it like a 4-step process. The first thing that you want to be doing is underlining the key parts of the question, so the number of lines that you're allowed to look at, and also the question topic. Secondly, you might like to draw a box around the section of text so that you are really clear with yourself as to what you can select and what you need to just ignore. Then within that box, you might like to underline any words or phrases that link directly to the question topic, so in this case, weather. And then finally, you need to write your points, and you can either quote or you can paraphrase. So general things to watch out for in this question. You just need to be careful to only base your answer on the information from the designated lines, so in this case 1 to 7, and then just make sure that you write about the topic that you've been asked to, as we've said before. Okay, so try another example then. Try to apply those 4 stages to the following extract, which is called Ghana Must Go. So you can see the question here is read lines 1 to 5 and list 4 things that we know about Olu. If you need to skip back in the video to recap what those 4 stages are, then you can do, and then try and apply them to this section. Pause the video if you need to before we move on to have a look at what answers you could have selected. Okay, so hopefully within the question you will have identified these key bits. In this case, you needed to only look at lines 1 to 5 and also note that you were being asked about the character of Olu. So hopefully you will have drawn a box around lines 1 to 5, and then within that box you will have selected information, specific words and phrases which are directly about Olu, so keeping it really tight about that question focus. In this case, things like the fact that Olu's going to put down his coffee, that he starts to cry, etc. So let's have a look at some of the example answers that you might have selected. So hopefully you had 4 of those answers and would therefore get 4 marks within that question. Okay, so the same source now for you to have another go at, but this time imagine that question 1 is worded differently. This time the question says read lines 1 to 13, find 4 things about the way that Olu is feeling. Try again to apply those 4 steps and pause the video, have a go, and then we'll have a look at possible answers. Okay, so this time you could have highlighted within the question lines 1 to 13 and also the specific question topic, which is the way that Olu is feeling. Naturally, within this question, you would really be looking for more implicit information because of the nature of the question. It's going to be less explicit, like the last one was. With the last question about Olu, it was more about him, and we were able to find lots of explicit details. With this, we have to kind of read between the lines a little bit to extract information about the way that Olu is feeling. So when we look at the answers in just a second, you will notice that actually there might be a mix of both explicit and implicit answers, but we'll recap that in just a second. So Hopefully you will have drawn a box around the entire section because lines 1 to 13 was what you were allowed to look at. Then within that section you may have highlighted some different information that tells you something about the way that Olu is feeling. For instance, the fact that he starts to cry, the fact that he's got no way of knowing, sleep deprived, and then this section at the end. So let's have a look what answers that information could have generated. Okay, so hopefully you will have got some of these answers from that piece of text. Now, as I was saying before about the difference between the explicit and the implicit information here, you will see that with answers such as Olu feels sleep deprived, that's quite explicit, because in fact, if we look back to our section of text, we literally get that quite explicitly, the fact that he tells us that he is sleep deprived. However, we've also there are also suggestions here for some more implicit information. So, for instance, the fact that Olu is feeling suspicious. If we look back at the text, that could actually be implied from these last 3 lines, that the doctors were wrong, that these things didn't sometimes happen, and that something happened out there. So implicitly, you might read between the lines and actually pick up on that kind of suspicious tone from those lines. Okay, so hopefully that has given you, reminded you of the process of question 1. Yeah, and good luck with that one.